When Inspector Hale pushed open the door, only two things awaited him: a ticking clock and a corpse that would never speak again. The room was locked, no way in or out, and not a single trace of the killer. But the most chilling detail was the small slip of paper clutched in the dead man's hand, bearing just two words: "You're next." The morning mist wove itself through the cobbled streets of Ashbourne Hollow, clinging to rooftops and curling around the towering oaks that lined the Manor Road, a ghostly presence refusing to let the village wake fully. The hush of dawn was broken only by the distant murmur of milk carts creaking along uneven stone paths, the shuffle of housemaids hurrying to their morning duties, and the occasional slam of a wooden shutter against the wind. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, something felt off. Eleanor Graves, seated in her modest yet impeccably arranged parlor, noticed it the moment she opened her window: the absence of birdsong, the way the fog clung too tightly, as if swallowing something it wished to keep hidden. The village of Ashbourne had its secrets, always had, but today they felt closer, pressing against the glass like unseen eyes. Her fingers, weathered yet steady, brushed against the crisp edges of the morning paper, but it wasn't the bold, dull headlines that caught her attention. It was a brief, easily overlooked mention on the third page: "Unusual occurrence at Blackwood Estate. Local authorities remain silent." That was all. No details, no elaboration, just an implication, a whisper of something out of place. And Eleanor knew better than most that silence often screamed the loudest. Just then, a sharp knock rattled her door, startling the stillness inside her home. It was young Oliver, the postboy, his breath uneven as though he had run the entire way. "A letter, Miss Graves," he said, his eyes betraying a hesitation that made her pulse quicken. Eleanor took the envelope, thick parchment sealed with deep red wax, its insignia unmistakable, the mark of Blackwood. She glanced at the boy, whose shifting feet spoke of knowledge he wasn't supposed to have. "You seem troubled, Oliver," she murmured, running her thumb over the seal. "Has there been talk?" He swallowed hard, his gaze darting over his shoulder as if expecting to be watched. "Just whispers, miss. Something's wrong at the manor." "Real wrong." Eleanor said nothing, merely offered him a coin before closing the door and turning the letter over once more. The wax seal cracked like brittle bone as she tore it open, and as her eyes scanned the words scrawled in hurried ink, a chill colder than the morning fog seeped into her bones. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of a plea: "Come at once. The house is listening." The door groaned open, a heavy, reluctant sound that seemed to echo through the cavernous corridors of Blackthorn Manor, allowing the constables to step inside as though they commanded the place. They didn't, of course. No one ever truly did. Not in a house like this. Not in a house that breathed secrets like air. The drawing room, once a jewel of grandeur, where whispered alliances were forged and broken, had turned into a mausoleum of velvet and shadow, the curtains drawn so tightly that the slivers of daylight struggled to invade. The air carried the stagnant weight of something unsaid, something unfinished, disturbed only by the deliberate, muted steps of the officers who moved through the room with an urgency that clashed against the manor's timeless stillness. Their boots scuffed against the ancient rug, their murmurs floated in the dimness, but none of them could see what Eleanor Vale could see. None of them could hear the house hum with a silence that was not merely absence but waiting. "Dead then," muttered Constable Harrington, his voice indifferent, as though remarking on the weather, his fingers scratching notes into a battered leather notebook. No sign of a struggle, could have been natural, just keeled over. Eleanor Vale, standing in the doorway with the stillness of someone who had seen too many endings and recognized when one didn't quite fit, arched a brow but said nothing. She didn't need to. The room spoke for itself. Theodore Blackthorn's body was slumped in an armchair that seemed to cradle him like a forgotten marionette, his pale face frozen in an expression that did not speak of peace but of unfinished thoughts. One hand rested limp on the armrest, the other clutched an exquisite teacup that had tipped, spilling its contents onto the carpet, where a dark stain bloomed like an ink blot on an unwritten page. Too neat, too precise. People did not die like this, not unless someone intended them to. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the room with the sharp precision of a mind that saw what others ignored. The teacup, a fine bone china piece with a delicate crack running down its side, an imperfection that felt deliberate, like a whisper in the ear of the observant. The scent of the room, subtle but telling, paper, dust and something else, something metallic lingering beneath the fragrance of dried roses. On the side table, an unassuming object, a small leather-bound diary, its pages worn from use, its spine recently bent as if its secrets had been revisited one too many times. She didn't need to read it, not yet. Clues were not always found in words but in the spaces between them. She hovered over the chair, eyes narrowing at a faint smudge on the collar of Blackthorn's coat. Ink, but not ordinary ink. This was something richer, rarer, a deep blue that whispered of expensive origins, the kind not bought in local shops but imported with letters meant to be read only in candlelight. Eleanor straightened, listening, a sound soft but distinct. The rustle of movement beyond the doorway, the careful, calculated hesitation of someone lingering where they shouldn't. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold, gone in an instant. The constables were too preoccupied with their own assumptions to notice. Assumptions were dangerous things, they made men look in the wrong places. Nothing obvious, Constable Harrington muttered. Perhaps the doctor should confirm if it was his heart. It wasn't, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but absolute. The officers turned to her, surprise flickering in their eyes. How can you be so sure? Asked one. Eleanor met his gaze, then looked back at the body, at the scene so carefully composed that it had betrayed itself. Because whoever did this, she murmured, wanted you to believe it was. She reached for the diary, her fingers ghosting over its cover before stopping. No, not yet. There was something else to find first. The game had already begun, and Eleanor Vale had never been one to lose. The mist had begun to recede, but it still clung to the edges of Thornwick Hollow like an unwanted memory, curling between the eaves of the narrow cobbled streets, whispering against shuttered windows. No one in this village ever walked too fast or spoke too loudly, especially not after a death. The houses stood in neat, perfect rows, their chimneys releasing thin curls of smoke into the damp air, but there was something too precise about them, too staged, as if someone had arranged them to conceal rather than to welcome. And Eleanor Hargrave knew better than to trust a place that tried too hard to appear innocent. She had seen the way the people of Thornwick Hollow carried themselves today, how the shopkeeper's hands trembled as he counted change, how the butcher's usual bluster was dampened by something that tasted too much like fear. Even the children, usually careless and wild, moved with an unusual solemnity, their wide eyes catching hers before darting away. Something had shifted in the air. The death of Edwin Lorimer had been enough to stir the careful, delicate balance of the village, and Eleanor was here to see just how deep those ripples ran. She passed through the village square, the early morning bustle subdued to murmured exchanges and quick, wary glances. Her steps took her to the post office, a small, tidy building where the smell of parchment and ink was thick in the air. It was there she found Simon Blake, his fingers fumbling with a neat stack of letters as he tried to appear indifferent to her presence. He failed. Eleanor had long mastered the art of appearing as though she had all the time in the world, and when she greeted Arthur the postmaster with a polite nod before turning her sharp gaze to Blake, the man's grip on the letters visibly tightened. "Blake," she said pleasantly, noting how he swallowed before mustering a tight smile. "Busy morning." His response was measured, forced, casual, but his fingers betrayed him, shifting the envelopes from one hand to the other, trying too hard to seem unbothered. Eleanor caught sight of the embossed seal on several of them, Hartwell and Sons Solicitors, a name she recognized. "Just sorting out a few family matters," he said, voice clipped. "Ah," she mused, tilting her head ever so slightly, "a tiresome thing, inheritances. So many loose ends." The way his jaw tensed was answer enough. She let the silence stretch, watching him fight the impulse to fill it. Silence, Eleanor had learned, was a weapon as sharp as any blade when wielded correctly. When she left him behind, pale and fidgeting, she made her way toward the tea room on the corner of the square, where the clink of fine porcelain and the rustle of silk skirts filled the air like a carefully rehearsed melody. She found Miss Genevieve Radcliffe there, seated by the window, a picture of perfect composure, not a strand of her silver hair out of place, not a single ruffle in her gloves as she stirred her tea with deliberate grace. Eleanor took in the scene, the careful way she leaned just slightly toward her companion, Lady Forsyth, a retired headmistress who had an uncanny ability to remember everyone's missteps but never her own. The two women spoke in hushed tones, but Eleanor knew better than to be fooled by appearances. There was nothing idle about their conversation. Eleanor let herself linger nearby, watching the way Mrs. Radcliffe barely moved her lips when she spoke, how her fingers tightened subtly around her teacup, when Lady Forsyth mentioned Edwin Lorimer's name. She was about to leave when something caught her eye, a faint ink stain on the pristine lace of Mrs. Radcliffe's glove. It was almost invisible, but Eleanor saw it for what it was, a slip, a misstep in an otherwise perfect performance. The scent of expensive ink had been faint but present in Lorimer's study, and now here it was again, hiding in plain sight. Eleanor allowed herself a small knowing smile before stepping back into the cool morning air. The mist had nearly vanished now, but the village's secrets had not. They never did, and she had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The dimly lit streets of Blackwood Hollow whispered with an eerie unease, as if the wind itself carried the weight of old forgotten stories. Miss Eleanor Graves clutched her small leather-bound diary in steady hands, pausing at the threshold of the ancient Birchwood Manor. People only spoke of this place in hushed tones, as if uttering its name too loudly would awaken something best left undisturbed. A withered tree loomed over the house, its skeletal branches brushing against the rotting shutters like a conspirator sharing secrets. Inspector Howard stood to the side, his pipe smoke curling into the night air, but his gaze was fixed beyond the manor's dark windows, into the kind of abyss only the truly damned could recognize. Another wealthy man, living alone, dying suddenly, he muttered with dry indifference. But Eleanor merely offered a knowing smile. This was no mere solitary death. This was something deeper, a puzzle woven with deception and malice. Inside the drawing room, Sir Alfred Blackwood's body lay slumped in an antique armchair, his stiff fingers still wrapped tightly around an old whiskey glass. But his face was strange, not twisted in agony, nor frozen in fear, but calm, almost content, as if he had been waiting for death to arrive. Eleanor inhaled softly, and the air carried an unusual scent, subtly sweet, with a faint trace of something bitter, something unnatural. Poison, Inspector Howard mused. Eleanor's sharp eyes caught the faint teal shimmer along the rim of the whiskey glass, an unmistakable sign of chemical interference. No, this was not an accident, this was intentional. Against the cracked wall, an old portrait hung, a young woman, her once beautiful face now faded into obscurity. Below it, on a dusty wooden desk, sat a well-worn leather diary. Its last few pages were filled with frantic slanted writing. Eleanor flipped to the final entries. "I know he is watching me, but this time, I will not turn away." Miss Graves closed the book, her smile deepening. This was not merely the case of a dead man, it was the unearthing of an ancient secret, a story as old as the manor itself. The people of Blackwood Hollow were silent, but behind their composed faces lay truths waiting to claw their way into the light. Eleanor knew that to unravel this mystery, she needed more than just questions. She needed to listen to the quiet spaces between the words, to the secrets wrapped in their silence. Something inside the manor was still breathing, still conspiring, and she would not stop until she brought it into the open. The town of Ashwick had always worn its history like a well-pressed suit, neat, controlled, with every thread in place. But beneath its polished surface lay the frayed edges of things long buried. Secrets whispered through the corridors of Holloway House, where Sir Leonard Ashworth had been found dead in his study just 3 nights ago. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, ever the quiet observer, stepped into the town's library. her gaze sweeping over the oak shelves and dust-laden tomes until it landed on Evelyn Blackwood, seated stiffly by the window. The woman did not belong in Ashwick. Not truly. There was something too composed about her, the way she held herself as if bracing for an unseen storm. Miss Blackwood, Eleanor greeted smoothly, her voice lilting with a politeness that made people second-guess their words. Evelyn's fingers paused on the edge of her book. Miss Whitmore, she replied, measured. What a surprise. I do hope I'm not intruding, Eleanor murmured, slipping into the chair opposite. I couldn't help but wonder, were you at Holloway House the evening Sir Leonard passed? The question hung between them, like the dust caught in the morning light. Evelyn's expression remained still, but Eleanor noted the flicker of hesitation, the barely perceptible way she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. I was there earlier that afternoon, she admitted. I had business with Sir Leonard. A trivial matter. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. How fortunate, then, that you left before his sudden misfortune. A delicate pause, or did you? Evelyn's lips parted, just slightly, but no words came. That was enough. Eleanor had played this game long enough to recognize when someone was deciding between a lie and the truth. Before Evelyn could find her footing, Eleanor stood. Perhaps we'll talk again soon, she said, her smile pleasant, knowing. From the library, she moved through the town's winding paths, each step measured, each thought precise. Her next stop was the office of Dr. Alistair Hale, a man of quiet intensity, with sharp eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that spoke too little. He looked up as she entered, his grip tightening around the edge of his desk. Miss Whitmore, he acknowledged, his voice level. I assume you're here about Sir Leonard. Everyone is, she replied, watching him closely. You saw him that night, did you not? A beat of silence. His fingers twitched, small but telling. Briefly, he said, too quickly. He wasn't well, fatigue, nothing more. Eleanor let the quiet settle, the weight of unspoken things stretching between them. And yet, she said finally, one might wonder why a man suffering from mere fatigue was found with a glass of brandy laced with belladonna. Hale stiffened, just a flicker. But Eleanor saw it, she always did. I have patients to attend to, he said, his voice clipped. Unless you have something more to ask. Not at all, she said, her smile never wavering. For now. She stepped back into the dimming afternoon, the puzzle shifting into place. Everyone in Ashwick had their parts to play, their lines rehearsed to perfection, but Eleanor had seen past their masks before, and she would again, because secrets, no matter how tightly held, had a way of unraveling in the right hands, and she had always been very, very patient. The tea room in Ashwick was much the same as it had always been, chipped china teacups, lace curtains that fluttered with the faintest draught, and the ever-present undercurrent of hushed speculation weaving through the murmured conversations. It was the kind of place where truths were softened with sugar, where secrets steeped like the strongest of teas, growing darker the longer they sat. Miss Eleanor Whitmore had chosen her usual table by the window, where the light from the overcast sky cast shifting patterns against the polished wood. The town had been restless since the discovery of Lord Halston's lifeless body in his grand study at Evermere House. A heart attack, they said, but Miss Whitmore had lived too long in Ashwick to take things at face value. She watched as Mrs. Abigail Fairchild settled into the seat opposite her, hat perched at a deliberate angle, fingers tightening subtly around the delicate handle of her cup. Such a tragedy, she sighed, voice thick with carefully curated sorrow. Lord Halston was a pillar of the community, and yet, she paused, letting the weight of her words settle. One wonders if all was truly as it seemed. Eleanor merely raised a brow, allowing silence to do its work. The most revealing truths were often the ones people rushed to fill. Mrs. Fairchild leaned in, lowering her voice. They say his affairs were complicated, that there were debts, people expecting things. And then, of course, there's the matter of Miss Rosalind Archer. Eleanor stirred her tea absently, though her attention was sharp. Rosalind Archer, the young governess employed at Evermere, had been conspicuously absent since the night of Lord Halston's death. Vanished, some said. Others whispered that she had been seen leaving the estate under the cover of darkness. A peculiar situation, Eleanor murmured, eyes flickering toward the door as it opened, admitting none other than Dr. Alistair Hale. His presence sent a ripple through the room, though he carried himself with his usual reserved calm. He nodded once in Eleanor's direction, but she caught the tension in the way he adjusted his cuffs, the way his gaze darted ever so briefly toward the tea-room's far corner, where an elderly woman sat nursing her tea, Mrs. Halston. Interesting. Eleanor took her time finishing her tea before rising, smoothing the creases from her dress as she made her way to the doctor's table. "Dr. Hale," she greeted. He looked up, his smile polite, carefully measured. "Miss Whitmore," he replied. "I assume this is not a social call." Eleanor's lips curved. "Lord Halston's passing must have been quite a shock," she said, watching him closely. "Especially given that you saw him just the evening before." His grip on his teaspoon faltered, just slightly, but enough. "Routine checkup," he said smoothly. Nothing seemed amiss. And yet, Eleanor mused, tilting her head, one might wonder why a man with no history of heart trouble should succumb so suddenly, and why Miss Archer should disappear in the very same night. Hale's expression remained impassive, but Eleanor saw it, the fleeting shadow of unease. He had expected people to ask questions, just not the right ones. As she turned away, Eleanor caught the faintest sound, the porcelain clink of a teacup trembling in unsteady hands. Across the room, Mrs. Halston stared into the depths of her cup, as if searching for something she could not find. It was all coming undone. The pieces had yet to fall into place. But they would. Secrets never stayed buried in Ashwick. Not forever. Eleanor would see to that. The tea-house in Ashwick had always been a place of quiet whispers and unseen glances, a place where the clinking of porcelain cups masked the weight of unspoken truths. The air was thick with the scent of steeped leaves and something sweeter, a deception wrapped in the comfort of routine. Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat at her usual table by the window, her presence unremarkable save for the sharp way her eyes traced the room. Outside, the village moved as it always did, but inside the pulse of gossip throbbed just beneath the surface. She barely lifted her gaze as Mrs. Harrow slipped into the seat opposite her, the older woman's hands fluttering over the rim of her teacup before settling it onto the saucer with practiced ease. "Strange times, Miss Whitmore," she murmured, her voice wrapped in velvet but edged with steel. "I assume you've heard about Lord Halston." Eleanor took a measured sip, the warmth of the tea a stark contrast to the chill that suddenly threaded through the air. "A tragic passing," she said softly. "But I imagine the truth is far less straightforward." Mrs. Harrow's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "The housekeeper claims he was in perfect health, and yet there he was, slumped over his desk, a half-finished letter beside him, and a single cup of tea turned cold on the tray." The weight of the statement settled between them, unspoken implications seeping into every pause. "And the governess?" Eleanor inquired, her voice carefully neutral. "Miss Rosalind Archer." Mrs. Harrow's fingers tightened briefly around her spoon. "Vanished. Left before dawn. No note, no trace. Just an empty room and a question no one dares to ask aloud." Eleanor's mind ticked over the pieces, fitting them into place like a puzzle half completed. "Guilt?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or fear?" Mrs. Harrow exhaled slowly. "That depends on what she knew, doesn't it?" Before Eleanor could respond, the tea-house door swung open, and a hush fell over the room as Dr. Hale stepped inside. His presence commanded attention, not for his stature, but for the way he held himself, as though perpetually weighed down by a burden unseen. He hesitated only briefly before making his way to their table. "Miss Whitmore," he greeted, his voice low. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor gestured to the empty chair, watching as he settled in, his fingers ghosting over the edge of his cup before stilling entirely. "You were close to Lord Halston, were you not?" she asked. The good doctor did not flinch, but his grip on the porcelain handle tightened just enough for her to notice. "I was his physician," he corrected, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something far less professional. "And yet, you never diagnosed an ailment." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Because there was none." Silence stretched between them. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels crunching over loose gravel. "Tell me, doctor," Eleanor murmured, setting her teacup down with deliberate care. "Do you believe in convenient deaths?" Hale exhaled long and slow. "No," he admitted, "nor in accidents where there should be none." Mrs. Harrow leaned in slightly, her expression unreadable. "You believe he was poisoned. It wasn't a question." Hale glanced around, his unease evident. "I believe," he said, "that Lord Halston was a careful man. And yet, his final hours were spent in solitude, save for the one thing he trusted most, his evening tea." The implication settled, heavy and inescapable. Eleanor allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The truth was inching closer, weaving its way through the fabric of half-truths and misdirection. The village may have been content to call it misfortune, but Eleanor had never been one to believe in coincidence. The pieces were falling into place. It was only a matter of time before the final one revealed itself, whether the guilty were ready for it or not. The scent of aged paper and ink lingered in the heavy air of the Whitmore estate's study, a room steeped in a history of quiet dealings and unspoken treacheries. Miss Eleanor Graves moved with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing over the dust-flecked wooden desk, where Lord Whitmore had taken his final cup of tea, an unfinished letter still resting beside the porcelain. The scene was too carefully staged, no chaos of a man struggling against his last moments, no sign of distress. Just a teacup with the barest shimmer of residue, its liquid turned a shade too dark, and the distinct scent of something just beneath the familiar aroma of Earl Grey. Poison, not an obvious one, not the sort that left a body convulsing in pain, but something chosen with precision, something designed to unravel a man's life, thread by thread, while leaving the cause shrouded in plausible misfortune. Miss Graves traced the rim of the cup with her gloved fingertip, watching as the faintest stain of unnatural sheen caught the candlelight. It was subtle, deadly in its subtlety, a poison that required knowledge, not impulse. And knowledge, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing a person could possess in this house. Her gaze shifted to the papers scattered across the desk, their placement deliberately careless. Lord Whitmore had been writing something before his death, but the ink was still fresh, glistening under the dim light. Too fresh. Someone had tampered with these pages, had rewritten a dying man's words to control the narrative that would follow, but they had underestimated her. The fibers of the paper bore slight indentations beyond the visible ink, as if something had been written and removed. With careful hands she reached for the fireplace poker, its iron tip still faintly warm, and ran it lightly over the page, revealing the ghost of the original words beneath. "Deception, among us the ledger," and then it faded, the heat lifting only fragments of the truth. But it was enough. The missing ledger, the one Lord Whitmore had been rumored to keep, a book of names, debts, and the sort of dealings that turned friends into enemies overnight. The air behind her shifted just slightly, the kind of change only noticed by those attuned to the quiet language of rooms where too many secrets had been buried. She did not turn immediately. "A rather late hour for tidying up, wouldn't you say?" she remarked, her voice measured. Mrs. Alcott, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her hands clasped too tightly before her. "I was just ensuring everything was in order," she said, but her voice held the hesitation of someone who had seen too much and dared not speak it aloud. Miss Graves finally turned, her sharp gaze taking in the way. Mrs. Alcott's fingers twitched against her apron. the faint smudge of ink near her wrist, a place it had no business being, unless one had been handling freshly written pages. I imagine there's quite a bit to set in order after tonight, Miss Graves mused, watching as the older woman's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. Something had been rewritten. Something had been removed. And somewhere in this house, behind carefully locked drawers and polite half-truths, the missing ledger waited. Miss Graves had no doubt that when she found it, she would also find the name of a killer. The room was too perfect, too still, as though frozen in time just before disaster struck. Miss Eleanor Graves moved slowly through the study, her sharp eyes flicking over every detail, the displaced books on the shelves, the faint indentations on the carpet, where furniture had been subtly repositioned, and the papers on the desk that at first glance seemed haphazard, but were in reality too carefully arranged. Someone had been here after the fact, someone who had tried to make it appear untouched. The teacup sat on its saucer, the last sip drained, yet the faint glisten at the bottom hinted at something unnatural, something that did not belong. She took a measured breath, her mind already calculating, poison, but a slow one, the kind meant to extend suffering, to mimic illness, to leave behind no obvious trace, unless one knew exactly where to look. And Eleanor Graves always knew where to look. A shadow flickered at the edge of the doorway, and she did not turn immediately. "Strange, isn't it?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of the diary left on the desk. A hesitation in the silence. Then the housekeeper, Mrs. Harcourt, stepped forward, her hands wringing together, eyes darting between the room and Miss Graves. "I noticed something odd, miss," she said, lowering her voice. "The chairs, they'd been moved more than once. The bookshelves too. Things aren't where they should be." Miss Graves finally looked up, her gaze unreadable. "Rearranged," she repeated, letting the word linger, testing the weight of it. "And you, Mrs. Harcourt, had no reason to move them yourself, I assume?" A flush crept up the housekeeper's throat, the flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "No, miss, I wouldn't have, but it looked as though someone was trying to hide something." Miss Graves nodded slowly, her mind piecing it all together with the precision of clockwork. The diary beneath her hand felt wrong. Its leather was too pristine, the ink too thick, too precise. It was not the work of a man scribbling desperate thoughts in his final days, but a crafted deception. She ran her gloved fingers along the spine, feeling the subtle inconsistencies, the stiffness where there should have been wear, a trail of breadcrumbs left deliberately, designed to mislead. The ink itself carried a scent, faint but familiar, one she had detected before in only a handful of places, rare, expensive, used for official documents, or more tellingly, secret correspondence. And yet it was not the diary that unraveled the lie, it was the weight of silence surrounding it. She turned back to the study, stepping toward the bookshelf. The misaligned books weren't just misplaced, they concealed something with a careful tug. She pulled one free, revealing the sliver of space behind it, a folded paper, tucked away where only the observant would find it. Unfolding it, her eyes skimmed the words hastily scrawled, in contrast to the diary's contrived perfection. Ledger missing, name found, danger close. The breath she took was measured, controlled, though her pulse quickened ever so slightly. Someone had known the truth, and someone had silenced them before that truth could be spoken. Mrs. Harcourt made a sound in the doorway, half strangled, half gasped, but Miss Graves did not look up. The study was not merely a crime scene, it was a stage. The furniture moved, the papers arranged, the poison carefully chosen. Every element of Lord Whitmore's death had been scripted, a carefully composed act of deception, meant to hide something far more sinister, and Miss Graves had just found the first loose thread. Now she only needed to pull it. The teacup trembled ever so slightly in Lionel Graves' hand, the porcelain barely making a sound as he set it down too carefully, too deliberately. Eleanor Whitmore noticed the detail instantly, the way his fingers lingered at the handle, as if steadying himself, the way his breath hitched just a fraction before he exhaled. It was a habit, a tic of a man trying too hard to conceal what lay beneath. The drawing room of Briarwood House was drenched in the warm glow of late afternoon, but the golden light did little to soften the chill of unspoken truths hovering between them. "Strange, isn't it?" she said lightly, letting her gaze drift over the meticulously arranged bookshelves, the pristine desk, the decanter of brandy placed just so, how things have a way of moving when no one's looking. A flicker of tension tightened Lionel's jaw, a shift so small it would have gone unnoticed to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Eleanor was always watching. She took a slow step forward, her gloved fingers trailing lightly over the edge of the writing desk, where a diary lay open, its pages pristine, its ink still bold against the crisp parchment, too bold, too perfect. The entries were contrived, as if written not for the writer, but for whoever might find them. "A shadow follows me, betrayal is closer than I think, poison has touched my lips." She read the words aloud, her tone even almost conversational, but the weight of them settled thick in the air. Across from her, Lionel stiffened, his fingers twitching toward the discarded teacup, before he caught himself. He was unraveling, just a little. "Dramatic, don't you think?" Eleanor mused, flipping another page, almost as if someone wanted to paint a particular picture. Silence, heavy, lingering. Then finally, a forced chuckle. "People write all sorts of nonsense in diaries," Lionel said, reaching for the brandy instead. His hands had steadied now, but Eleanor had already seen enough. He had been careful, so very careful, but control was a fragile thing, and it had begun to slip the moment she walked through the door. The ink, the furniture, the diary, it was all a performance, carefully staged to mislead. But Eleanor had spent years reading between the lines, unearthing the truth in the pauses, the hesitations, the unguarded moments, when a lie fractured just enough to let the light in. She turned back toward the bookshelf, her fingers brushing over the spines until she found the single volume that was just slightly out of place. A classic misdirection, but not a clever enough one. With a measured tug, she pulled the book free, revealing a folded slip of paper wedged behind it. A whisper of a smile ghosted across her lips as she unfolded it. The ink was familiar, the words scrawled in hurried, frantic strokes, so unlike the neat calculated script of the diary: ledger missing, name found, danger close. Lionel's glass clinked as he set it down a little too fast. Eleanor exhaled softly, a sound of recognition rather than surprise. "Ah," she said simply. So it wasn't just paranoia after all. The room held its breath, and Lionel Graves had nowhere left to hide. Lionel Graves adjusted his cuffs, his fingers brushing the edge of the polished mahogany desk as he exhaled slowly. The flickering candlelight cast elongated shadows across the room, a deceptive calm blanketing the suffocating air. Eleanor Whitmore watched him closely, her sharp gaze piercing through the carefully constructed mask he wore. "You were at Wexley Manor the night Mr. Arkwright passed, were you not?" she asked, her voice measured yet unyielding. A beat of silence stretched between them before Lionel inhaled sharply, his lips pressing together in a thin line. "I was," he admitted, his voice lacking its usual smoothness. "Only briefly. Mr. Arkwright had requested my presence for a minor legal matter, nothing of consequence." Eleanor allowed the silence to settle, the weight of her stare pressing against him. "And you noticed nothing out of place?" Lionel shifted, his fingers tightening against the desk's edge. "Nothing," he said, but it came too quickly, too rehearsed. Eleanor's lips curled slightly, though she made no effort to press him further. Instead, she glanced at the assortment of letters on his desk, their wax seals unbroken. "Curious," she mused aloud. One might think a man as meticulous as yourself would have caught the smallest inconsistencies in that evening's events. Lionel's jaw clenched, his shoulders rigid. She had struck a nerve. Good. Leaving Lionel to stew in his own discomfort, Eleanor moved through the dimly lit corridors of the estate, the air thick with unspoken truths. Outside, the town of Evermere lay cloaked in the hush of midnight, its cobblestone streets empty save for the occasional glow of a lamplight behind shuttered windows. The tea house on Market Street was still open, its gilded sign swinging slightly in the autumn breeze. Inside, Beatrice Langley sat with poised elegance, a delicate porcelain cup held between gloved fingers. She glanced up as Eleanor approached, her smile polite, distant. "Miss Whitmore, what an unexpected pleasure," she said smoothly, though the flicker of something cautious crossed her gaze. Eleanor took the seat opposite, her eyes never leaving Beatrice. "A pleasure indeed. I imagine you've heard the whispers regarding Mr. Arkwright's untimely passing." Beatrice set her cup down with deliberate care, her fingers lingering against the rim. "Whispers, rumors," she mused. "Evermere is fond of such things." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I imagine you more than anyone would know which ones hold weight." Beatrice's expression remained composed, but Eleanor caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the faint hesitation before she responded. "If you're asking whether I had any knowledge of the difficulties within the Arkwright estate, I assure you I keep myself uninvolved in family quarrels." Eleanor tilted her head, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Uninvolved, perhaps. But unaware. I find that unlikely." The candlelight flickered between them, shadows shifting with the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Beatrice's fingers curled slightly against the tablecloth, a subtle movement, but enough. Eleanor had seen it before, the minute hesitation of someone treading carefully over the fragile web of deception they had spun. "Surely you don't think I—" Beatrice began, but Eleanor cut in, her voice smooth. "I think the truth is rarely as clean as we'd like it to be. And I think you, Beatrice, are not quite as removed as you pretend." The air between them stretched taut, the quiet hum of the tea house offering little refuge from the weight of Eleanor's words. Beatrice exhaled, a calculated move, as if considering how much to reveal. "If I were to speak on the matter," she said finally, her voice softer, "I would only say that there are certain truths that some would rather remain buried." Eleanor leaned back, satisfied. The game had begun, and the pieces were falling into place. The night was still young, and the truth, however deeply concealed, would soon be unearthed. The village of Ashcombe lay draped in an eerie stillness as Eleanor Winslow stepped into the dimly lit parlor of the Elmhurst Inn, her sharp eyes scanning the room with practiced patience. The air carried the faint scent of old books and lavender, a deceptive calm masking the undercurrents of unease that had settled since the untimely death of Mr. Aldous Penbrook. At a corner table, Samuel Hawthorne sat rigidly, his fingers pressed tightly against the armrest of his chair, his expression a careful blend of forced ease and restrained tension. Eleanor approached with the measured grace of a woman who knew precisely the weight her presence carried. "Mr. Hawthorne," she greeted smoothly, lowering herself into the seat across from him. "I believe you were at the Penbrook estate the night Aldous met his unfortunate end." Samuel's fingers twitched, just slightly, but enough for Eleanor to catch. "Briefly," he admitted, his voice even, though the flicker of something darker, hesitation, uncertainty, lurked just beneath the surface. "I had business with him regarding the estate's finances. It was a routine matter." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "A routine matter that required you to be there well past midnight." The silence stretched, Samuel's jaw tightening ever so slightly before he forced a placid smile. "I was merely ensuring his affairs were in order," he said, his words carefully measured. "And when you left Mr. Penbrook was alive and well?" Eleanor asked, watching the way his breath caught just before he nodded. "He was," Samuel replied, though the conviction in his tone wavered just enough to betray him. Eleanor let the moment settle before rising, her expression polite but unreadable. She had extracted what she needed. As she stepped out into the fog-laden streets, her thoughts turned to her next encounter. The manor's longtime housekeeper, Beatrice Whitmore, had always been a fixture of the Pembroke household, a silent observer who Eleanor suspected knew more than she let on. The door to Whitmore's modest cottage creaked open at her knock, revealing the woman's scrutinizing gaze. "Miss Winslow," Beatrice greeted, her voice careful, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. "To what do I owe this visit?" Eleanor stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the cluttered yet meticulously maintained sitting room. "I've been speaking to those who were in Mr. Pembroke's orbit," she said simply. "His passing has left quite a few questions." Beatrice's lips thinned slightly, but she did not invite Eleanor to sit. "Tragedies do, Miss Winslow, but not all questions need answering." Eleanor met her gaze evenly. "Some do." A beat of silence passed, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Beatrice finally exhaled, setting her cup down with deliberate care. "Mr. Pembroke had his ways," she said at last. "Ways that did not always sit well with others, including his family." Eleanor pressed. Beatrice's expression flickered just for a moment, but long enough. "Family is a complicated thing," she murmured, "especially when money is involved." The pieces were beginning to take shape, the whispers of deception growing louder beneath the town's quiet veneer. Eleanor had seen it before. The carefully constructed facades, the secrets that lingered in the pauses between words. Someone had orchestrated Aldous Pembroke's demise, and they had done so with precision. But the truth had a way of revealing itself to those who knew where to look. As the evening mist rolled in over Ashcombe, Eleanor Winslow stepped back onto the cobblestone streets, her mind already assembling the fragments into something whole. The game was afoot, and she was closing in. The village of Blackwood was steeped in a silence that felt unnatural, as though the very air conspired to keep its secrets buried. Detective Eleanor Henshaw adjusted her gloves as she stepped through the threshold of the apothecary, where the scent of dried herbs mingled with something more acrid, more unsettling. Behind the counter, Edwin Graves stood rigid, his fingers idly smoothing the pages of an open ledger, though his eyes flicked up at Eleanor's entrance, dark and unreadable. "Detective," he greeted, his voice measured, cautious. "What brings you here?" Eleanor smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Just tying up loose ends," she said, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "You were among the last to see Mrs. Rosalind Whittaker before her passing, weren't you?" Edwin's hands paused, just briefly before continuing their motion across the paper. "She had been unwell," he admitted, his voice carefully even. "Came in complaining of dizziness, fatigue, nothing that seemed urgent. I prescribed her a mild tonic, nothing more." Eleanor nodded slowly, letting the quiet settle between them like a thick fog. "Mild," she repeated, watching as Edwin shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "And yet she collapsed that very night, never to wake again. Strange, wouldn't you say?" Edwin met her gaze then, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite place. "People fall ill," he said simply. "Age catches up to them." Eleanor took a slow step forward. She was 52, she murmured. "Hardly an age to simply drop dead overnight. And then there's the matter of the locked doors." Edwin's fingers twitched. "Locked?" "The servants found her bedroom bolted from the inside," Eleanor said, watching him closely. "No signs of forced entry, no one entered or left." A muscle in Edwin's jaw flexed. "A tragic coincidence." "Perhaps," Eleanor said lightly, though her eyes remained unwavering. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, did she mention anything unusual that night? Anyone she feared? Any concerns?" Edwin hesitated, just for a breath, before shaking his head. "Nothing of the sort," he said, but the lie was as clear as the flickering lantern light above them. Eleanor studied him a moment longer before stepping back, allowing him the illusion of reprieve. "Thank you for your time," she said, turning toward the door. "I may have more questions later." She didn't wait for a response as she stepped into the cold night air, her mind already turning over the next thread in this tangled web. Her next stop was the Whitaker estate, its grand facade now shadowed with grief. Inside, she found Margaret Lyle, the housekeeper, her normally stern features drawn with something deeper than sorrow. "Detective," Margaret said stiffly, dusting invisible lint from her apron. "I assume this isn't a social call." "Hardly," Eleanor replied, studying the older woman's tense posture. "I need to know, what was Rosalind Whitaker's last day like?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. She was restless, she admitted after a moment. Kept checking the time, looking toward the window, as if expecting someone. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Expecting someone, did she say who? Margaret hesitated, then sighed. No, but she was uneasy, distracted, and then after her visit to the apothecary, she seemed resigned. Eleanor's brows knit together. Resigned to what? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "That," she said, voice tight, "I cannot say." But Eleanor knew the answer was there, buried in the silences, in the flickering expressions people thought they could hide. Someone had orchestrated Rosalind Whitaker's death, and they had done so with cold, deliberate precision. But secrets, no matter how well kept, had a way of surfacing. The game had begun, and Eleanor Henshaw was not one to lose. The air in Ashcombe Hollow carried a hush, the kind that settled thick over cobbled streets when a secret was close to being unearthed. Detective Evelyn Harrington moved through the narrow lanes with a measured pace, her keen gaze tracing the flickering lamplights that did little to push back the creeping dusk. She had spent the afternoon gathering accounts, words spun with careful calculation, each one laced with omissions that whispered louder than any confession. It was at the apothecary that she first sensed the frayed edge of truth, a place lined with shelves of remedies, vials labeled in slanting script, where Mr. Percival Alden stood with a quiet tension. His hands, calloused from years of careful measurements, trembled just slightly as he reached for a bottle of valerian root. "Detective," he greeted, his voice smooth but lacking its usual confidence. "A pleasure as always." Evelyn stepped closer, the scent of dried herbs mingling with something more metallic, more unsettling. "I was hoping to ask you about Helena Sutterfield," she said lightly, though her eyes were sharp. "She visited you the evening before she died." Percival's fingers froze around the glass vial before he exhaled, forcing a thin smile. "She wasn't well," he admitted. "Came in complaining of dizziness, fatigue. I gave her a tincture for sleep." A pause. Nothing harmful. Evelyn let the silence settle, watching as he avoided her gaze. "And yet," she murmured, "she never woke up." Percival's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could weave another careful response, Evelyn stepped past him, her gloved fingers trailing along the counter. "It's curious," she continued, "because you weren't the only one to see her that night. Witnesses placed her at the edge of Hawthorne Lane, near the manor. The apothecary was small, but in that moment, it felt suffocatingly close." "Odd, don't you think?" she pressed. "A woman so unwell wandering so late." Percival's hand twitched, knocking a small vial to the floor, where it shattered between them. "Accidents happen," he muttered, kneeling to clean the mess. Evelyn simply watched. "Yes," she murmured, "they do." And then she left, the door swinging shut behind her, leaving him alone in the dim glow of candlelight. The manor was next, a looming spectre of a house, its iron gates curling like the twisted branches that lined the drive. Lady Vivienne Blackwood greeted her at the threshold, draped in midnight blue, her expression poised but unreadable. "Detective," she said smoothly, "I wasn't expecting company." Evelyn stepped inside without invitation. "I prefer to arrive when I'm least expected." The drawing room smelled of burning cedar, the fire crackling low in the hearth. "Helena Sutterfield was here the night before she died." Evelyn said without preamble. Vivienne tilted her head, feigning mild interest. Was she? Evelyn took in the perfectly arranged sitting room, the untouched tea service on the table, the single book open but unread. She was seen leaving just before midnight, she continued, watching carefully for the telltale flicker of recognition. It came not in a flinch, not in a word, but in the way Vivienne's grip on the armrest tightened just briefly. And yet, Evelyn mused, the servants say the household had already retired for the night. Tell me, Lady Blackwood, who was awake to let her in. The question hung between them, sharp as the blade Evelyn knew had been used before. Vivienne's lips curved, but the smile was empty. Detective, she said softly, sometimes it's best to let the dead rest. Evelyn met her gaze unyielding, and sometimes, she replied, it's best to make sure they were allowed to live in the first place. The fire crackled, and in its glow she saw it, the smallest shift in Vivienne's mask. A mistake. A crack in the porcelain veneer. The trail had been faint, but she had found it, and soon there would be no place left for the truth to hide. The remnants of the evening storm still clung to the narrow streets of Ravenshade, the scent of damp earth and distant thunder lingering in the air, as Detective Celeste Vane stepped carefully through the grand hall of Blackwood Manor. The room was steeped in an eerie silence, its once opulent furnishings dulled by neglect, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. On the polished surface of an antique table sat a single porcelain teacup, untouched yet deliberate in its placement, a quiet proclamation of an unfinished story. Lady Eleanor Blackwood had been found slumped in that very chair only hours before, the remnants of tea still clinging to her lips, her breath already stolen by something insidious. Poison. Not a quick, merciful dose, but a carefully measured, slow-working substance designed to mimic illness, to deceive, to mask the true hand behind the crime. The teacup was meant to be the first clue, but Celeste knew better. It wasn't about the tea, it was about who had placed it there and why. She turned, eyes sweeping over the figures in the room. Lord Vincent Blackwood, stiff-backed and composed yet betraying the faintest flicker of unease in his rigid stance. Marian Dunn, the ever-faithful housekeeper, whose trembling fingers betrayed a deeper knowledge than she dared admit. And Henry Whitmore, the family solicitor, whose polished shoes and pristine cuffs did little to hide the sweat beading at his temple. Each one of them a player in this tangled deception, each one concealing more than they revealed. Celeste's gaze landed on Vincent, noting the way his hands curled ever so slightly as though resisting the urge to clench into fists. Lady Blackwood's will was altered shortly before her death, she stated evenly, watching for the reaction beneath his carefully constructed facade. A slight shift in his jaw, the briefest twitch in his fingers, small but enough. She made changes, she continued, stepping closer, and those changes didn't favor you. The fire crackled in the hearth, the sound loud in the otherwise suffocating stillness. Vincent's lips parted, then closed again. A moment too long before answering. She was not of sound mind, he said, too smoothly. The stress affected her judgment. Celeste's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Or perhaps it was fear, she murmured, letting the words settle like embers in the air. Fear of someone who knew how to play the waiting game. Her mind sifted through the details, the fragments of truth hidden among the deception, the spilled ink on Eleanor's writing desk, the hastily closed ledger, the whisper of an argument heard by the maid in the dead of night. It wasn't the inheritance that had sealed her fate, it was something older, something buried deep in the foundations of this house, a secret too dangerous to let slip. The truth was not just in the poisoned tea, or the altered will, it was in the lingering scent of lavender on Eleanor's bedsheets, in the careful way her jewelry box had been disturbed, in the locked drawer in Vincent's study. A secret worth killing for. The walls of Blackwood Manor had witnessed more than their fair share of betrayals, and now they held one more. But Celeste had all the pieces now, and soon there would be no more shadows to hide in. She exhaled slowly, eyes dark with certainty. It was just a matter of time. The air inside Ravenshade Manor was thick with the scent of aged mahogany, and the lingering traces of a fire long since reduced to embers, its glow barely flickering against the dark panelled walls. Inspector Celeste Vane sat comfortably in the high-backed chair near the hearth, her gaze sweeping across the assembled figures, each one carefully composed yet betraying something in the tautness of their expressions, in the nervous tension of their movements. Lord Alistair Graves, his cold aristocratic features masked by a well-practiced air of indifference, but his fingers, oh his fingers, clenched too tightly around the edge of his chair. Margaret Whitlow, the housekeeper, whose otherwise placid demeanor cracked ever so slightly when the subject of the poisoned tea had first been mentioned. And then there was Edwin Rowe, the ever-dutiful solicitor, his polished shoes tapping an erratic rhythm against the floorboards, his eyes flickering toward the door as though contemplating escape. But Celeste knew better. There was no escaping the truth, not now, not when the lies had begun to unravel. And yet, someone in this room thought they could outmaneuver him, thought they could make his death appear inevitable, even expected. A quiet illness, a slow decline, the kind of tragedy that would evoke pity rather than suspicion. She let the words linger, watching the reactions, Lord Graves' shallow breath, Margaret's hands twisting in her apron, Edwin's Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. But illness did not take him. No, this was far more calculated. A game of patience, of precision, of careful methodical deception. She reached into the folds of her coat, producing a single folded page, the final entry from Elias's personal journal, written in the unmistakable slant of a dying man desperate to record a truth before it was too late. "Trust is a fragile thing," she read aloud, her voice taking on an almost eerie softness, "easier to break than to build, and I fear now that I have placed mine in the wrong hands." A pause just long enough to let the weight of those words settle. He suspected, he knew. Her eyes lifted, finding Edwin Rowe's, watching as the color drained from his face. "The will was altered," she continued, tapping a single manicured nail against the parchment. "Not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time subtle enough to go unnoticed, at least until now." She shifted her focus, her voice dropping to something quieter, deadlier. "And yet, it was never about the inheritance, was it?" The fire crackled, sending shadows flickering along the walls like specters waiting to claim the guilty. The tea had been the perfect weapon, a poison slow enough to mimic the frailty of age, undetectable to the untrained eye. But it was not the poison alone that gave the culprit away. It was the teacup. A single cup, always placed in the same spot, always handled with an almost reverent care, as though its position mattered far more than it should have. A habit, ingrained. A tell, unnoticed by most. But Celeste had noticed. "Margaret," she said at last, her voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. The housekeeper flinched, her lips parting, but no sound came. "You poured the tea, you ensured he drank it, day after day. But you weren't working alone, were you?" A sharp inhale, the quietest gasp from Edwin's lips, the first true crack in his composure. Celeste leaned forward, a slow, knowing smile curving at the edges of her lips. "And that," she murmured, "is where your carefully constructed lie begins to fall apart." The room stood still, frozen in the moment before the inevitable collapse. Celeste had played her hand, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth, coiled waiting, would rise to the surface, consuming everything in its wake. The air in Blackthorn Hall was heavy with the scent of aged books and dying embers, a stillness settling over the grand drawing room like dust over forgotten secrets. Inspector Eleanor Graves sat with unnerving composure, her sharp gaze fixed on the man by the fireplace, Theodore Finch, his fingers twitching ever so slightly as he clutched his glass of brandy, his knuckles paling with tension. The others, Beatrice Langley, the widow with a grieving face that never quite matched her cold eyes. Rupert Hale, the solicitor who had a talent for twisting words as deftly as he twisted his cufflinks, and Marianne Finch, Theodore's own sister, who had been silent far too long. Each stood like chess pieces on a board where the endgame had already been decided. The fire crackled once, a sharp snap in the oppressive quiet, and Eleanor let the moment stretch, her presence alone commanding the space. "The truth," she finally murmured, her voice deceptively gentle, "has a rather inconvenient way of surfacing, no matter how carefully one tries to bury it." Theodore stiffened, his jaw clenching, but Eleanor did not look away. Instead she reached for the small porcelain object on the table beside her, a teacup, delicate, unassuming, yet carrying with it the weight of a crime so meticulously planned, it might have succeeded. "This was placed precisely here," she continued, turning it slowly in her hands. "Not an accident, not a simple misplacement, but a deliberate act. And do you know what struck me as particularly interesting?" She paused, letting the question settle, watching as Theodore's fingers tightened around his glass. "You never drank from it, Mr. Finch. Not once. You see, people have habits, small unconscious things they do without realizing. You fidget with your glass, but never with a cup, and yet, that night, you insisted on serving the tea yourself." A sharp inhale from Marianne, a flicker of movement from Beatrice, but Eleanor remained fixed on Theodore, who swallowed but said nothing. "The poison was subtle," she continued, her voice like the slow tightening of a noose. "Not immediate, not dramatic, just enough to weaken, enough to be dismissed as an unfortunate illness. And then there was the matter of the will, a revision signed in trembling script, mere days before his death. But of course we know now that the ink was still drying when his body was found. How curious, don't you think?" Her eyes gleamed with something close to satisfaction, as Rupert Hale let out a breath, his carefully neutral mask slipping for the first time. "Forgery is an art," Eleanor mused, setting the teacup down with a deliberate clink. "And poisoning, well, that is a science. But deception," she tilted her head ever so slightly, "that, Mr. Finch, is where you faltered." Theodore's breath had quickened, his once perfectly composed features unraveling thread by thread. His fingers twitched, his eyes darted to the door, calculating, desperate. Eleanor merely smiled. "You see, you were too careful," she whispered. "You wiped the rim of the poisoned cup, but you forgot the smallest thing, the teaspoon. The faintest trace remained, enough to confirm what I already knew." She leaned back, as though the confession had already been spoken. "And now you have nowhere left to hide." The silence that followed was deafening, and then finally the dam broke. Theodore Finch let out a strangled breath, his posture crumbling, the weight of his carefully woven lies collapsing in on him. "I had no choice," he choked, his voice hoarse. "The debts, the estate, He stopped, as if realizing that no excuse could ever be enough. The fire crackled again, indifferent to the ruin before it. Eleanor Graves merely watched, unmoving, unyielding. "There is always a choice, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice cool, final. "You simply made the wrong one." The village of Ashwick had returned to its usual rhythm, the cobbled streets kissed by the early morning mist. And yet the hush that had settled over its people was not quite the peaceful kind. It was the silence of whispers waiting to erupt. At the heart of it, in the familiar warmth of Lillian Hartley's tea shop, sat Inspector Edith Blackwood, her hands curled around a porcelain cup of Earl Grey, its delicate rim stark against the rough-hewn certainty of her fingers. Across from her, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose regal bearing could not entirely mask the lingering tension in her eyes, studied the inspector with a quiet sort of apprehension, the kind that only comes when one has seen the thin veil between civility and truth torn away. "It's remarkable, really," Mrs. Whitmore murmured, stirring her tea with measured grace, "the way things seem to settle as though nothing ever happened. And yet," her voice drifted, the thought left unfinished, an echo of the unspoken truths they both knew lurked beneath the surface. Edith allowed a pause, watching as a pair of villagers passed by the window, their hushed conversation punctuated by wary glances. "That's the way of things, isn't it?" she finally said, voice soft yet laced with an edge. "People pretend, they move forward, but the past never really leaves them, it simply waits for the right moment to resurface." The case had been one of patience, of shadows shifting just out of reach until, at last, they had settled into a form too solid to ignore. Lord Bertram Alden had been found dead in his study, the scent of aged mahogany and burnt parchment mingling with something far darker, strychnine, laced into his evening brandy with meticulous care. The household had been quick to grieve, but quicker still to guard their secrets, each member wrapped in their own carefully constructed facades. His devoted wife, Lady Frances, who clutched at her mourning veil with hands too steady for fresh grief. His nephew Vincent Alden, whose inheritance had been all but promised yet remained just out of reach. And then, of course, Mrs. Whitmore herself, the long-time family friend, whose concern had rung just a little too practiced, whose alibi had been wrapped in the kind of convenience Edith never trusted. "It was always about control," Edith continued, setting her cup down with a deliberate clink, watching the way Mrs. Whitmore's fingers twitched ever so slightly against the lace of her cuffs. "You see, people don't kill out of impulse nearly as often as they'd like to believe. No, they do it out of fear. Fear of losing what they've convinced themselves is theirs. And Lord Alden, well, he was going to change everything, wasn't he?" A quiet inhale, almost imperceptible. But Edith saw it, the way Mrs. Whitmore's throat bobbed just slightly, the way her gaze flickered for the briefest of moments. The will was rewritten. Edith pressed on, voice as smooth as the quiet drift of autumn leaves against the window pane. He had decided to leave it all to charity, to strip away the safety net that had been so carefully crafted. And you couldn't have that, could you? A tense silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken confessions thick in the air, and then, just as Edith had expected, Mrs. Whitmore's lips parted, her voice measured but hollow. "I only did what was necessary," she said, barely above a whisper, her grip on the teaspoon tightening, as though she could hold on to the last remnants of her carefully built world. "He would have left me with nothing." A sigh, a slow shake of the head. "No, Mrs. Whitmore," Edith said, her tone neither cruel nor kind, merely inevitable. "You left yourself with nothing, and just like that, it was done. The village would move on, the whispers would fade, and soon enough, someone new would sit in that very spot, spinning another tale of certainty, until, in time it too unraveled. Because in Ashwick, as in all places where people believed themselves untouchable, the truth had a way of finding its voice, whether they were ready to listen or not. The village of Ashwick, bathed in the muted gold of the late afternoon sun, seemed as serene as ever, its cobblestone streets dappled with the shifting shadows of old oak trees, the air carrying the crisp whisper of approaching winter. Yet beneath its placid surface, a storm of hushed conversations and stolen glances churned, an echo of the secrets that had been unearthed, of the truth that had been forced, clawing into the light. In the quiet refuge of Holloway's tea room, Inspector Edith Blackwood sat opposite Eleanor Graves, a woman of quiet poise and calculated silences, the fine china between them trembling ever so slightly in Eleanor's grip, though her expression betrayed nothing. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" Edith mused, her voice carrying the careful weight of observation, rather than accusation, "how quickly a village like ours mends itself, how swiftly it forgets, at least on the surface." Eleanor's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Forgetting is a kindness, Inspector. Dwelling on unpleasant matters rarely does anyone any good." But Edith merely tilted her head, watching the way Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her cup, a practiced motion, a habit, one she had no doubt carried for years. "Forgetting perhaps," Edith allowed, but pretending. That's something else entirely. A beat of silence passed between them, an unspoken challenge, before Eleanor exhaled, her gaze flickering toward the frost-laced windows where the villagers passed by, their steps a little quicker than usual, their conversations a little too hushed. The murder of Lawrence Wren had shaken Ashwick, not because it was gruesome. No, poison was a subtle killer, a whisper rather than a scream, but because it had forced open the doors to secrets long buried. A man of wealth and influence, Lawrence had lived by a simple creed, that power was his to wield, that the lives around him were mere pieces on his chessboard. It was a belief that had served him well, until someone had decided he no longer deserved the privilege of drawing breath. The suspects had been many, their motives tangled in threads of old grudges and new betrayals. His business partner, who had much to gain and even more to hide, the quiet maid, whose careful silence masked a heart full of fury, and Eleanor herself, whose connection to Lawrence was deeper than she had ever cared to admit. Edith had seen the way her eyes darkened at the mention of his name, how her voice grew just a fraction tighter. The past, after all, never truly stayed buried. The past never really disappears, does it, Eleanor? Edith said at last, voice soft probing. It lingers, it waits, and then when you least expect it, it slips through the cracks. Eleanor's fingers stilled, her breath catching just slightly, a moment so brief that it could have been imagined, and yet Edith knew it was not. People do what they must to survive, Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Some wounds never heal, Inspector, and some debts. She hesitated, her gaze locking with Edith's, something unriddable passing between them. Some debts must always be paid. The words hung between them, heavier than the scent of steeping tea, denser than the unspoken truths that lay just beneath the surface. Indeed, Edith said, her tone betraying nothing. Outside, the village carried on, as it always did, its people moving through the motions of normalcy, eager to believe that all was well. But Edith knew better. The world, after all, was never as simple as good and evil, as guilty and innocent, and in Ashwick, the past had a way of creeping back, of demanding its due. As she rose from her seat, her coat settling around her shoulders like a second skin, she allowed herself the barest of smiles. The case had been closed, justice in its imperfect way had been served, but peace, no, that was only ever borrowed, and in time she knew, the next storm would come.